Good evening. My name is Mary Ann Barnes. I'm with the League of Women Voters. I'm the co-chair for our Centennial Committee. And I just wanted to let you know about a few other things that are going on. This is really for the League, because we're collaborating with a lot of different organizations on almost all of our activities. But for us, this is sort of a kickoff for our centennial activities. And so I'm really happy to be here for that. But I just wanted to let you know that if you're interested in what else is going on, this is a pamphlet that has all of the activities that the League is going to be involved with in this coming year. Included in this is a very significant symposium that's taking place April 18th. We've got a couple of really, really good speakers coming in for this, Paula Giddings, Dawn Teal, and the League of Women Voters National CEO, Virginia Case. And we're very excited about this symposium. It's going to explore the history of the women's suffrage movement, both its glory and its blemishes. And so I think it'll be a very interesting symposium. And with the idea that we'll take this information and see how we should move forward into the next years. This is for the opening of the exhibit at the Western Reserve Historical Society. I think it'll be a really cool exhibit. There are a few of these out there if you're interested in going to the opening reception. There's information here on that. And then I'm going to wait and introduce Carol to tell you more about the rest of the Women's Empowerment series. But before I do that, I just wanted to also let you know that we have, this is election season, and so we have what we call Vote 411, which is the League's, the National League, or actually it's a national website, but we have filled it up with our local elections. So if you want to do some research on your candidates, just go to Vote 411, put in your address, and your ballot will come up, plus information on the candidates that are running in your area. And then last but not least, we're always looking for donations, and now we have a text to donate, and that is on the back of this little card. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen Lawrence, who is going to talk a little bit more about the Women's Empowerment series, of which this is the first one tonight. Yes. All of this stuff is out there. I just have whole table. Okay. Right.
Hello, thanks everybody for coming. My name is Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of Faculty Engagement here at Case Western Reserve Siegal Lifelong Learning. So thank you for coming out on this cold and icy night to help us kick off this centennial series that I'm so excited to be doing with the League of Women Voters to celebrate the 19th Amendment and sort of have an entire year in addition to that amazing symposium that's going to be in April, to have sort of an entire year celebrating women's suffrage, what we've done in the last 100 years, what we're looking forward to doing in the next 100 years as well. As some of you may know, this was not supposed to be our very first lecture of the season. We were supposed to have one in January, but Joy Bostic had to cancel. I'm very excited to let you guys know, if you were signed up for that lecture as well, that it is not actually a cancellation, it's just a postponement, and that she's going to be giving her lecture in September. So look for that later on. So it's a long postponement, but it will happen. And by then her talk was going to be and will be Our Voices, Our Vote, Courage and Persistence in Black Women's Struggles for Voting Rights. So that's going to be in September. More immediately next month, next month's lecture, there's also a flyer out there for that, is going to be on Thursday, March 26th at 6:30, so just a little bit earlier, also way across town in the Lakewood Public Library. And it's going to be by Angela Clark-Taylor, who's the new director of the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women at Case Western Reserve University. And she's going to be talking about a collector's tale memorabilia of the American women's suffrage movement. And then, of course, again, the Suffrage Symposium in April. I would recommend going online and signing up for this. There's going to be a lunch, and so there is a little bit of a fee, and so just to keep that in mind. But that's going to be phenomenal and really, really great. But that's not what we're here for tonight. Tonight we're here for our inaugural lecture, Beyond Suffrage, Women's Reform Networks and the Road to Women's Rights, by Einav Rabinovitch-Fox, who is a visiting assistant professor in the history department at Case Western Reserve University. Her PhD is in history from New York University, in modern U.S. history with a particular focus on women and gender history. She examines connections between fashion, politics, and modernity, and has been publishing on these topics. And her book, forthcoming, is Dressed for Freedom, The Fashionable Politics of American Feminism, which explores women's political uses of clothing and appearance to promote feminist agendas during the 20th century. So join me in welcoming Einav. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And everybody hear me okay? Great. So thank you again for coming, especially today and this evening in this very cold and icy winter day that we got. So I thank you for this introduction and for being here. The year 2020, as you heard, is full of marking and celebrations and centennials, and actually not just of the 19th Amendment, but the 19th Amendment is certainly one of them, and it's the ratification of it. On May 21, 1919, after a very long and successful campaign that lasted over 70 years, the House of Representatives finally passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, on June 4th, the Senate followed. In a relatively short ratification process, something that maybe today is very hard to imagine, given the recent ERA battles that going on for seems almost a century as well. Tennessee became, on August 18th, 1920, the 36th state to ratify the amendment. Back then, there were less states, so there's only 36 states. And it was certified into the Constitution on August 26, 1920, so that's the official day that we celebrate. And in public discourse and kind of like popular culture, we refer to the 19th Amendment as the one who gave women the right to vote. But if you look at the amendment, it actually doesn't grant anything. Certainly not rights. It determines that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. That's basically what it says. It says that you cannot be prevented from voting on account of sex, but it doesn't give you the right to vote. And really, the 19th Amendment did not give the right to vote for women. Actually, even before the 19th Amendment, 15 states already gave women the right to vote in their constitutions. And even after the 19th Amendment was certified into the Constitution, not all women could vote. In general, it was mainly white women and some African American women in the North. But if you look at this very complex timeline of the progression of voting rights, so for example, Native American women were only given the vote in 1924 when Congress made Native Americans citizens of the United States. Although it was not until 1948 when all restrictions on Native American voters were struck down. Asian Americans, people from East Asia, both men and women, got access to the vote only in 1952 when they got the citizenship. But kind of like the grand moment was 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. That really is the one that ensured and gave the ability both to African American people in the South, including women, and other minority that really struck any barriers. And for those of you who are young here, so in 1971, we can vote from 18. So there's not only gender limits on voting, there's many limits on voting. So as you can see, when we talk about kind of like women's rights and the right to vote and the 19th Amendment is really not the end of this story or the end of this struggle. It's really just maybe an end of a chapter or even the beginning of a very, very long book of struggles for gaining rights that continue really until today. And certainly 1920 and this centennial should definitely be celebrated, and it should be celebrated as a victory. We should also ask ourselves, what exactly are we celebrating, right? And what this victory really meant for women, for democracy, and especially for America, right? So another way maybe of posing this question is when we talk about women's suffrage and the struggle for women's right that the struggle for suffrage was definitely part of, what exactly are we talking about? So today in my talk I want to address this question and to look not only about the right to gain the vote, but kind of like look at it at a broader context of a larger effort to promote women's status and equality, and to look at the history of activism that began in the 19th century, roughly. Again, there's the debate, when did the suffrage movement started is also something that we debate today, but really last until today. And what I want to show is that really for many activists, even hardened suffragists, gaining the right to vote was not the most important thing. It was part of their larger reform agenda that they strove for, and that they look at it as part of a kind of like a broader reform agenda to promote women's rights. So it was never the end goal. It was, the 19th Amendment was oftentimes kind of like, we need the right to vote in order to do something, other stuff. So it was never the end goal, it was a mean to an end for many people. And I think that this is kind of like help us to rethink a little bit of this movement and what did it try to do, and kind of like to put it in a long history of women's movements in America and the rise and fall. And today I will also focus mostly on Ohio and kind of like in a more local perspective, but it's really important to remember that this is a national battle by and large. So it's a national story. And we're lucky that actually a lot of people from Ohio got to be famous enough to rise to the national level. But although every locality has its own story, as I said, 15 states can, celebrate different centennials. But Ohio can't. Ohio did ratify it only in 1920. But it is kind of like more of a national story. And I want to kind of like also to connect and highlight the connection between this local and national, and how women's political activism, not necessarily for suffrage, really helped to kind of like what does it meant to kind of like this broader struggle for women's right. So another thing that might be worth mentioning is that political activism, when we talk about political activism, it's not necessarily just voting or representation or just in politics, right? Politics is a very broad term, and women in the late 19th and early 20th century certainly grasp it as a broad term. women were politically active long before they got the right to vote or they had any access to elections. The suffrage movement itself, what we tend to think of as a suffrage movement, began in the 1840s, and it also stemmed from another form of very important activism at the time, and the Abolitionist Movement. So the struggle against slavery. And what was that? It was women who felt that their voices were not heard enough in that movement, that people were kind of like disregarding them, kind of like got together and said, okay, so all the men, all the abolitionist men kind of like ignoring us, what can we do? So we gonna have a convention and we're gonna talk about stuff that relates to women. So in 1848, they got together in Seneca Falls, New York, not very far from here. And the issue of women's right and women's suffrage was definitely discussed in that convention, but it was a women's right convention. Women's suffrage was definitely part of it, but it wasn't the only topic that was debated and declared in that conference. And what you can see here, so the end of the conference, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is a very prominent feminist at the time, writes the Declaration of Sentiments, which is kind of like a manifesto for women's rights. It is written on the format of the Declaration of Independence. So God created all men and women equal, right? And we have inalienable right that we can, it really is kind of like one-to-one, the Declaration of Independence. But, and as you can see, a lot of people signed it, but we don't have that document. Nobody thought it was important enough to keep it. So we have the table where she wrote it, and we know who signed it, we know what it says, but the actual document is nowhere to be found, not in the Library of Congress, not in everywhere else. So it does also suggest to you that maybe at the time people did not think it was such a big deal, right? Because nobody thought of, oh, maybe we should keep it to prosperity, because maybe it will be the founding document of this suffrage movement that will later lead to a constitutional amendment. But no, nobody thought it was important enough to keep. So we don't have it. We only have reproductions of it. So just this kind of like gives you a sense of how much women's suffrage was important, right? For people, even for people who pushed for it. And really, so in the 19th century, suffragists, which is kind of like the nickname that they got, focused their efforts not on passing an amendment, but kind of like on a larger issue. They focused on, for example, women's rights within marriage. In the 1840s, we're still living under the coverture law. When you get married and you lose your identity, you become consumed with your husband's identity. So they fought to abolish that. They fought the right to own their own property. Another the right to access for employment, to education. That was something that also was very important to them. And they also talk about, yes, the right to vote. But it would take a while until they figuring out that, okay, the right to do it is through a constitutional amendment. First, they think it would going to be an easy way. We're just going to convince all the states, and it's going to be very easy. And it takes them a while to understand, well, maybe men don't like this idea, and we need to fight for it. But before the women's suffrage movement kind of like become what it becomes, and it was never kind of like the largest women's movement in kind of like in the period of time that they were. That's another thing. You know, most women did not care about suffrage, right? Did not care about getting the right to vote. Actually, the largest women's movement in America at the time is the Women's Christian Temperance Union that was also founded in Cleveland. So another point of pride in 1874 that it was here that the organization was fully, and that organization fought for prohibition. And they were more successful than the suffragists, because the Prohibition Amendment is the 18th Amendment. And they get it without the right to vote, right? So that also shows you how women are politically active even without the vote. They don't need those political roots in order to get what they want, in that case, banning of alcohol. Although the organization, once Frances Willard is becoming its president, she endorsed suffrage agenda and she endorsed suffrage, women's suffrage. But again, this is never the main thing that the Temperance Union is advocating. They're advocating for prohibition. And again, they're more successful than that, than feminists, than suffragists. So kind of like to show you those examples, women are working for suffrage, but not really, right? For them, they have a lot of political agendas that they are interested in and they want to get done. And since they're barred from this political process, and again, what we think of today's politics is very different from what it was in the 19th century, right? Today, we're going, everybody taking their children, right, to see what it is. The polling places are in schools, and we want to, it's a kind of like a family event. This was not the case in the 19th century. In the 19th century, if you wanted to vote, polling places were oftentimes in bars, or worse yet, in brothels or saloons. Not places that, you know, a respectable woman wants to go in to begin with. Right? It's very problematic for these women to get involved. Political unions and parties are meeting also in those places. So it's not very easy to get involved in the political process because it's not just places that makes you feel comfortable. These are not places that a respectable woman should be in. And once they're barred from this, partly because the places where this politics is happening, they find other avenues for politics in places that they're okay to be in. And it's mostly the home, but what they do is they take and they build institutions which are considered to be apolitical and really the expansion of their home. So like a mother is, you know, in charge of cooking and cleaning and raising the children and getting to the education, that's what they do. They get involved in education reforms. They get involved in, it's called the City Beautiful, right? To make streets clean and lampposts and kind of like they decorating their house, they're also decorating their neighborhoods and their cities. They're just, you know, expanding what they do. They're not, you know, they're not trying to change anything or the world. They just, you know, expanding the home. And that's what kind of like the women's politics, and they develop this style. And men are okay with that because this is not where politics are being made. Politics are being made in voting, in candidates, all the deals and corruption that you hear about. That's what men do. And women wants, you know, clean houses. Okay, fine. Clean streets, lampposts. Fine, let's give it to them. And that's fine. So they're kind of like starting to get into all kind of reform efforts. And the late 19th century really gives them a lot of opportunities to do that, partly because this is kind of like a great time of social change in America, wave of immigration, industrialization, urbanization, all the problems that we have today, right, started back then. and women are starting getting involved in those efforts. They building settlement houses, they building schools, they're building orphanage, all this to help the new poor immigrants, right? Immigration is a big issue at this time, like today. Nothing really changed, believe me. I'm a historian, nothing has changed. And they do that, and this is not political, what they do, even though it's, today, healthcare, children, right, children education, all the things that candidates today are talking and discussing on primaries platforms, these were not politics back in the day. But we know this is right. This is very much political. And women are kind of like taking advantage of the fact that, we can actually do meaningful work without men noticing us, right? But they do get a lot of voice and influence on those topics. They're becoming experts in child labor, in health issues, in education. Men listen to them on those issues. They would not listen to them on, who should be the president, but they should. But they definitely listen to them. So in Cleveland, who do we have that deals with that? Rich women. Helen Garrison Wade, Flora Stone Mather, all those names. These are women with a lot of money, a lot of time. They don't need to work for a living, and they can do whatever they want, basically, right? So these women are taking their money and their wealth and building institutions that benefits our community. Garrison Wade, for example, is very much in charge of Beechbrook, or what was then the Protestant Orphan Asylum. And she gives money to the organization, to the orphanage. She come and work with the children. She does a lot of kind of like volunteer work. She's very important. Flora Stone Mather, which is a household name in Cleveland, right? She founds in 1896 the Goodrich House, which is a settlement house that it's kind of like a JCC of today. It does a lot of programming for the community, for the poor. She's also the founder of the Women's College in Western Reserve, that by 1931 will get her name, Mather College. And these women really cultivating their own identities as philanthropists. And as I said, they're definitely not suffragists, and they're definitely not saying they're working for women's rights, but they're just, expanding the home, right? But what they're doing by this expansion of the domestic sphere is really giving models for the generation who will come after to show what you can do with money and what you can do in politics and how can you get influence. And these models will later be imitated. And also the institutions that they built will, beyond kind of like just providing good things to the community, will also give experience to women who will later become suffragists once suffrage become kind of like a more popular goal. So for example, Flora Stone Mather was also the founder of the Consumers League in Ohio. And the first president of the Consumer League of Ohio is Belle Sherwin. This is the institution where Belle Sherwin, which I hope everybody here in this room knows who she is. She's a very well-known suffragist, Cleveland-born. She'll become in 1924 the national president of the League of Women's Voters. And she begins her career in the Consumer League. So what interests her is advocating for what we call now fair trade, to work for labor rights, that the stuff that we buy is not made by child labor and is manufactured under fair conditions. So those are the campaigns that she gets involved in and give her the first kind of like political experience. It was kind of like the white label campaign. It's a campaign that was like, that encouraged people to buy only those kind of like those white labels products that meant that we checked and these are good. These are not kind of like made by exploitive conditions. And Sherwin really credit the Consumer League to her career. She says, it gave a number of women in Cleveland a practical knowledge of laws and lawmaking, which for her was important. She saw the Consumer League as a laboratory of political education. And it's also served her as, again, while the League itself did do a lot of things, at one point Sherwin understood that women's power is limited if they don't have the vote. So if they don't have leverage to influence politicians, to make laws and to pass regulation that will ensure safe working conditions and against child labor and stuff like that. So there's only so much that the League can do. And that's what she realized, that she needs to push for suffrage, not because suffrage is such a great goal, but because it's a means for her to get what she wants in the Consumer League. So again, this was kind of like a path for women to get the reforms that they really wanted to do in order to gain kind of like the leverage that they kind of like, at one point they felt like, okay, we're hitting this wall and we need to change it. But other activists, so she begins her in the Consumer League, but other activists started their career in the labor movement and working for labor rights. So Mary Grossman, who is another prominent Cleveland suffragist, she began her career in the Wage Earners League. And Zehra Dupont, another prominent suffragist, was also a champion of labor. Like Sherwin, who was the daughter of Henry Sherwin from Sherwin-Williams. Again, Zehra Dupont is also from the Dupont family, one of the richest families in this country. Again, people with a lot of money. Dupont was kind of like a rebel girl. She refused to go to her coming out party. She didn't want that. She preferred to go and stand up with strikers instead. And like Sherwin, she took the family wealth and promoted what she thought should be promoted. Not sure her parents approved. But once suffrage becomes a popular cause around the 1910s, they take those money and kind of like funnel it into getting the vote. And as you can see, and right, from the request for donations, those movements always looking for money, always. That's how social change is being done in this country, apparently. And this help from rich women who can get this financial backing is really, really important to that movement. But as you can also notice by kind of like those names, these women are coming from a very unique experience and unique point of view. For them, they're working for voting for working class people, and they do think that suffrage in the end will benefit all society. But their perspective is, we're upper middle class white women, we're educated women. This is how they see the vote for them. We want to make our voice heard. And they are very much coming from this point of view. And sometimes it's often, it shapes the way that the struggle is being fought in a way, because the suffrage movement, in the end of the day, is a very elitist movement that is made of people like Sherwin. It's not that African Americans or working class people were not involved in the movement. They were, and we know about those actions. But the leaders of the movement are women who has time to devote to the cause. In order to time to devote to the cause, you cannot work, right? Those of you who are social activists and on full time know that. This is a job of itself, and you need money. And many of them are also kind of like arguing, and some of them feel that, you know, we as educated women deserve the right to vote. Maybe we deserve it more than people who are immigrants, than people who are illiterate, than African Americans. And they use also those type of arguments to say we deserve the vote because we're respectable women, because we're educated women. So this is kind of like just an example of a cartoon that was, if you can see, so you can see kind of like a very racist depiction of a Chinese man next to an African American, next to what would be a criminal. And then he shuts the door on the beautiful women who cannot go and vote, while these despicable men can. So as you can see, it's a very complex politics in terms. The suffrage movement was not as inclusive as we wanted to think, and these women bringing this worldview into their activities. As I said, many are them coming to the suffrage movement, many activists coming to the suffrage movement through reform movements in other places. But another route to kind of like become a suffragist is through education. Women's colleges are a very big thing in the late 19th century, and while only a minority of women ever go to college, only 2.8% of women in the United States are enrolled in colleges in the 1900s. Many of those 2.8% are becoming suffragists. And these are, many of them are going to colleges, to women's colleges in the East, also called Seven Sisters, if anyone here is a graduate. These are more inviting and welcoming spaces. These are places that actually teach them and having this intellectual environment. They're not just teaching them how to become good mothers or good wives. They're actually letting them pursue professional careers and professional and intellectual pursuit. And so it's a great place. There's like no pressure. Nobody tells you, oh, you need to look pretty and be silent, right? They can do a lot of things. And many of them ended up being involved in suffragists. Many of them are pursuing also graduate degrees. This generation will be the most educated generations in history, even today. There's more PhDs given to women in 1920s that they're giving now. So just take a moment to think about it. These women are really are highly educated. But what happened when they graduate from college? They can't get a job. There's discrimination. So what can they do? They can go to reform work, right? They can go to work for suffrage. That's another kind of like this experience of like, we are trained women, we're smart, we can do a lot of things, and then we don't have the option of doing it, is what pushing them to join the suffrage movement. They represent kind of like a generation that we call the new woman. You can see here kind of like a depiction of the schoolgirl. These generation, they often don't get married because, again, at that time you had to choose. Although, you know, Katie Stanton was a mother of 10, I think, and a very supportive husband. That's what you need, a very supportive husband. But other than Katie Stanton, most of the leading suffragists are either single or widowed, and many of them do not have kids. It's hard to, you know, running around all over the country fighting for suffrage if you need to take care of 3 children at home. There were some, but not many. And this college experience really shaped these suffragist ideas, and they are starting to see also colleges as a place for political mobilization, right? Like today. So in 1900, 2 Radcliffe students, Maud Wood Park and Inez Hens Gilmore, are founding the College Equal Suffrage League. And that sought to recruit women in college to the suffrage movement. They worked mainly with the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, that was the largest movement at the time, the largest suffrage movement at the time. But they were kind of like a branch of it. And that's another thing to think when we talk about the suffrage movement, we're really talking about umbrella of organizations. So it's never one suffrage movement. There's also, and many of them are also fighting each other and not agreeing with each other because it's women and that's what they do. And everyone had their own opinion of what's the best way to get the vote. So the suffrage movement is kind of like more movements, but the equal, the College Equal Suffrage League is really beginning. Maud Wood Park is running around in Ohio and other places. By 1906, they have branches and chapters in over 30 states. In Cleveland, the College of Women in Western Reserve formed its chapter in 1908, recruiting both students and faculty. And many other Cleveland suffragists also have connections with the College League. Minerva Kline Brooks, she's a Vassar graduate, and she becomes in 1910 the charter member of the Cleveland chapter of the organization. Ruina Woodham Jelliff served as the president of the Oberlin chapter. So these women are becoming, they're in this area, and they will later become more involved in the Cleveland chapter. Another anecdote, Jelliff and Kline, both of them are kind of like more into the arts. They will be very much advocates for arts. So again, this is their cause, right? This is their reform agenda, and suffrage is just part of it. They are never kind of like full-time suffragists. The College League, so that is kind of like another avenue for women to get involved. Belle Sherwin, again, she graduated from Wesley at 1890. So she's like 10 years before the Equal Suffrage League is ever happening. But she meets Maud Wood Park, and then, sorry. Okay. So I missed a slide. This is from Case Western Reserve. suffrage club. And my husband told you to show you that the meeting is from 12:30 to 12:45. So in 15 minutes, they are gonna be very efficient. So he was like, this is really funny. You have to tell them. So I was like, okay. See, that's how suffrage got won. 15 minutes and you get your agenda done. So anyway, so Belle Sherwin meets Maud Ward Park in her excursion in Ohio, and then she joins the League, even though she's kind of like older, and she, as I said, she graduated from Wesley in 1890. The League was founded in 1900. Another very prominent suffragette in Cleveland, Florence Allen. She also met Maud Park while she was studying law at New York University because she couldn't get into Western Reserve. They did not let women get into law. So she had to go to New York, and in New York she meets Wood Park. She joins the movement. Park gave Allen her first job as the organization secretary, and they become involved in the campaign in Ohio. So again, this is another place for women to get along together, and you might see a pattern here. Women are really looking for those spaces where there's no men, and they can say whatever they want, and they can do whatever they want, and they can come together because they have this support community that really allows them to work together. And they realize that's what we need, and that's the way we can, achieve our goals. And that's what they're doing. Ellen really credit this personal alliance that she gets in the movement and the support that they later help her also in her personal career. And she will become a Supreme Court judge in Ohio, not the Supreme. And she really credit, what I learned, and these women that I met and worked with, they helped me to become a judge. She says, I was the beneficiary of the entire women's movement. She really felt thankful for them. Her friends that she did organized her campaigns, helped her to get elected, and it was that understanding that we need to create those support networks, that it's not just about individual making history or breaking those glass ceilings, that will enable them to really advance women's rights. So in 1916, Sherwin and Allen and other suffragists are founding the Cleveland Women's City Club, located in Public Square. This was a direct response to the male-only city club that was founded 4 years earlier in 1912 that, again, barred them from participation. So they said, okay, we'll form our own club. We don't need you. And it was kind of like to encourage women to get involved in civic affairs, offer them a place for public discussions, to promote the welfare of the city of Cleveland. And again, while all of them are suffragists, they're really, the club itself does not take a political stand. It does not endorse or work for suffrage formally, although all of the women there do work for suffrage. But it does revolve around kind of like those voluntarist activities that really help society. Again, we're not challenging any gender or sexual hierarchies. We're not trying to be the men. We're doing the stuff that we know we're good at. And you probably cannot see, but but the Women's City Club president, so all the women who are married are with their husband's name. So it's Miss Henry, blah, blah, blah. They don't, only Miss Belle Sherwin, who never got married, will maintain her name. There are other misses there, but all the misses are with their husband name. And that's also tell you something about their gender politics. They're not feminist in the way that maybe today will define feminism. And so this city club was about kind of like, there's topics from public arts, from not just politics, right? All kind of civic causes, education, children welfare, not really suffrage. And this approach, which argued that, we're doing the stuff that we're good at, and we're really into bettering society, is an argument that that we bring unique qualities, right, as women to the political realm, was an argument that suffrage began to use more and more in the 1910s until the 1920s, and was part of kind of like the argument for why they deserve the vote. So in general, suffragists used two arguments that were often contradictory. One said, we deserve the right to vote on account of equality because we are the same as men, and hence we need the same right. The other one says, no, we're not the same as men. We are bringing something other to politics. We're feminizing politics. We can clean up politics because we are women, because we're not doing all those dirty dealings that men do. We will clean up politics, and this is why you need to give us the vote, because we will change politics. And they did in many ways. But by focusing on that, this approach kind of like helped them kind of like ease fears that that a lot of men had, that once women get the vote, oh my God, like all, men will have to take care of the kids, and then, all the women get to work, this gender reversal. So they say, no, we're just, we will keep doing the children stuff, but just, just in the political realm. So this type of activities gave women the support networks that they really need, but it really also gave them an excellent experience, right, in political campaigning, working in a settlement house, or writing for a newspaper, or standing on a picket line, or giving lectures. All of those things women learn to do on the way when they're doing other stuff. And then they take all those skills and really devote it into suffrage. So Mary Grossman, for example, learned how to canvass city neighborhoods. And when she worked for the Wage Earner Leagues, a tactic that she later used to her own election campaign as a judge. You need to get that kind of like courage to go to people and, can you sign this? Can you, right? It takes time. Florence Allen, on the other hand, she honed her public speaking abilities when she kind of like campaigned for suffrage for the 1912 referendum, which unfortunately failed. But they were really close. It was like 80,000 votes difference. So they're kind of like using all those campaign tactics to get attention, to shaping in the process kind of like what political campaigning looks like, What we think today of political campaigning ads, right, that you need to come and kiss babies and all that, these are tactics that actually suffragists perfected and invented. Zehra Dupont, you remember her? So she led the 1912 campaign riding her car, her Winston red car, and all over Ohio. And think about it, in 1912, a woman driving a car, going all around this state, it's an attraction. Like, people coming to see that, that's something nice. And so they're using trains, they're using cars. Florence Allen famously rode the Votes for Women trolley as part of her campaign, and she kind of like stepping in on and off and giving speeches. She said to give 92 speeches in 88 counties. And partly it's like people are coming to see it because it's an attraction. Because, wow, woman is like walking, talking in public. That's like, that's what they're doing. And so, but despite of all that, the measure fails, as I tell you. They're trying again in 1914, again organizing towards a referendum. They organize a parade in Cleveland. 3,000 women are marching. More than 200 men are also joining. They're leading the parade. Was the personification of Joan of Arc riding on a white horse. Again, very visual tactics that they are using to get people attention. The Joan of Arc is kind of like a reference to a more famous campaign, the Washington, D.C. campaign in 1913. This is Inez Milholland on that horse. This was the march a day before Wilson inauguration. You can see references from the Women's March of 2017. That was the march that really, the Washington, D.C. march, that was the march that really put suffrage into the national agenda. There was a lot of press because of Wilson inauguration, and suddenly women walking in the street, that was a lot of attraction. And so they didn't get just covered in the local press, the New York Times, the Plain Dealers, right? The Chicago Tribune, all of those big national papers are coming. They're coming for Wilson, but they're already in the city, right? So they will watch those women parading, and that's what kind of like takes off the suffrage cause. So suffrage is really implementing all kind of colors and tactics and theatrical spectacle in order both to show that there are, it's an attraction and it's interesting, but also show again that, look at us walking in our beautiful embroidered signs and marching information and all this organization, this beautiful women walking in the street. Look what happened if you only give them the vote, right? They will clean up politics. They will beautify politics the way that they're marching in their beautiful signs. So that's kind of like, despite the fact that they are stretching kind of like the lines of like women marching, this is not the most respectable thing to do. In the early 20th century, they're marching in streets, which are male territory, but because they're doing it so nicely with, children and flags, right? They're showing, we're not that scary, and the idea of women voting maybe is not that scary at all. And these tactics certainly help to popularize the suffrage cause for these women. But what really maybe shifts the things for their favor is World War I. They are joining wholeheartedly into the war effort. Belle Sherwin will head the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense in Cleveland, overseeing women contribution in terms of volunteering, food preservation, working, and really giving the war effort. That was a common strategy of the national American women's suffrage movement. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president, she believed that if women will show how patriotic they are, how they contribute to the war effort, men will have to kind of like give them the vote, right? They could not ignore this. That was the bet she took, and that bet worked. There were other suffragists who instead started picketing in front of the White House and getting jailed and getting hunger strike and force fed. That thought that that's the reason to push on Wilson. But other suffragists saw, no, we will just be good citizens. We'll show you that we are good citizens, and then you'll give us the right to vote. And that somehow maybe that bet was successful. So in 1917, the Ohio Assembly passed the amendment to give the right to vote for women in the presidential elections, as part of kind of like this thankfulness to the word effort. And while this was also ultimately defeated in the Senate, Ohio did become the sixth state to ratify the amendment in the end. And the justification, again, for endorsing suffrage, President Wilson said, we have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? So this kind of like notion that we need to pay them back. And finally, they got it. But that's not the end of the story, right? That's part of what we're trying to say. So even after the 19th Amendment was ratified, women continued their political activities. Carrie Chapman Catt, even before the amendment was ratified, kind of like seeing what's going on, and she founds the League of Women's Voters. Again, sensing that women will need guidance of how to vote, right? This is a very complicated issue, especially in America. So we need a forum to educate women how to become citizens, how to vote, how to participate in politics. But again, they're nonpartisan. They're endorse all candidates. They really tried not to become politicized. The Cleveland chapter was organized in 1920. Sherwin was its president. She will later leave it in order to become the national president. And again, although they did not endorse candidate, the exception for it was Florence Allen, which she ran for a judge. She ran as an independent, so I think that was their excuse. But part of it was because, these were her friends, and these were her people who kind of like, she worked with them. So they were like, we're going to help her get elected. Like, this is not, even if we're supposed to be nonpartisan. So Allen was elected as the first woman to the Court of Common Appeals and got elected. And she also recruited her friends to other positions, making history. She would later become as I said, the Supreme Ohio judge. The Ohio State Supreme Court, and later on, Franklin Roosevelt will nominate her to the Sixth Circuit. And rumors said that Roosevelt also wanted to nominate her to the Supreme Court, So she could have become the first woman to be elected to that, but that didn't happen, as we all know. Partly because Roosevelt got in trouble with the court, so that was part of that. But again, and the Cleveland chapter of the League of Women Voters, so it does work on kind of like educating women, but it does work on other, continue those reform agendas. They were in favor of the federal Shepherd-Towners Maternity and Infancy Act that passed in 1924. Again, looking at causes that were feminine, that were something that women were supposed to work for. They worked to bar child labor, to enforce minimum wage for women. They joined the anti-war and pacifist movement that are really starting to get force after World War I, before it became not kind of like a good cause. In 1924, again, Sherwin will become the national president, and she will leave that post in 1934 to be appointed to FDR's Consumer Advisory Board of the National Recovery Administration. So coming kind of like full circle from the Consumer League of Ohio in Cleveland to the National Consumer Advisory Board. So again, she was a suffragist, and she is known as a suffragist, but she's also known as other things, right? And for her, suffrage was something that she did, but certainly not her life work. So kind of like to conclude this understanding of how women continue fighting for rights and for causes. Voting was kind of like a contested issue, and was part of that maybe reform goals that were more palatable, like banning child labor or maternity act. Although as we see today from the fights over the ERA, apparently equal rights for women are not. Some attorney generals in some states don't think it's something that should be written into the Constitution. Again, we need to think about when we're fighting for it, like, is voting really the most important thing, or do we need to fight for other things, and what really promotes women's rights? And we need to, when we look at that period and these women, we also need to kind of like think about the model that they set for us in terms of this building of coalitions and support networks of women. They did not turn to men for that. They really support each other, and really something that continues maybe until today, right? That no matter what the topic women rally behind, they realize that the power is really in their numbers and the collaboration that really makes their voice heard. So thank you, and we'll... Yes, Mike.
How did women vote in 1920? Was it basically the same as men by party, or were they more liberal or more conservative?
So it's a great question. So part of the reason that there was so resistance for women's voting is because people feared there's going to be a women's bloc, that they will vote as a bloc to promote women's agendas, and then, the whole world will collapse, right? If we let women organize everything. But what turn out to be is that women vote, surprise, surprise, like men vote. They vote both Republican, both Democrat. What we do know from states that ratified before 1920, when women were able to vote, because the Democratic Party was very much anti-suffrage, much more vocal about it. So women tend to, at first, to be vote more Republican, just because they were more of the pro-suffrage party. But very, very quickly, by 1924, very quickly, so in one, election cycle, it really became kind of like they voted on the same pattern, similar to men. They did vote to oust anti-suffragist candidates. And then they kind of like really voted as a bloc and managed to get some people, like in New York, in other states, candidates who kind of like voted against suffrage and for the ratification and stuff like that. These were, once women got the vote, these people were out. So revenge was sweet. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that you were talking about the women just worked with each other and not with men. But the Declaration of Sentiments, men signed it as well as women.
Right. Yeah. And again, in that time, in the early 20th century, before they're really gathering towards this federal amendment and really gaining into suffrage, men were part of that. Because men were also part of the abolitionist movement, right? It was kind of like something that they worked together. And only around 1870s, around the debates on the 15th Amendment, that gave African-American males the right to vote, right? It's the first time that the word male was in the Constitution. It got a lot of women angry. Some of them said, well, this is the black men's hour. You need to wait. We need to get that done first. And they were like, no, we need to push for a universal suffrage. We need the 15th Amendment to be suffrage for all. And because of all political, situations, it wasn't possible. Like, the people knew that that it will pass, only if it will be African American men, and that kind of like cause a fracture between in the suffrage movement and between women who like, okay, we'll do it ourselves. We don't need men, and people who did collaborate. And as I said, the suffrage movement was never a single movement, and there were other organizations that work more with men. But by the way, the 19th Amendment is also on the same wording as the 15th Amendment. So it was written, and for a long time they thought it's going to be the 16th Amendment. It's like, okay, we'll pass the 15th, and very quickly we'll pass the 16th, right? And that will be the women's suffrage amendment. It took them 3 more amendments to go, or 4 more, right? So, and 1870 to 19, so in 50 years apart. So, yeah. Okay, I'll read the question. How can campaigns of Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar be fit into this story? It's a great question. I mean, Hillary Clinton definitely made the connection, at least in her, not in her 2008 running, but certainly when she became the nominee, and even in the primaries, she really used the woman's card, and she really presented herself as this continuing the legacies of suffragists. She wore white like the suffragist, right? She kind of like framed herself, I'm her, her grandmother, her mother was born in 1920 when women got the right to vote. So she did a lot of those connections to the suffragist movement. Klobuchar, Warren, not so much, right? But on the other hand, and it's interesting, both of them are mothers. Both of them are married, and we don't hear that, right? Hillary Clinton talked a lot. I mean, she can ignore her husband, but right? But she also talked a lot about Chelsea. That her role as a mother was something that really was attempt to kind of like, she really played that card. Klobuchar and Warren don't. And they're trying to, and in some sense, they're kind of like trying to, I think, look at their own, like, we're politicians, right? And it doesn't matter what our genders are. They're not playing so much that, although you can argue, I mean, at least Klobuchar in the debates, she is kind of like bringing a new style to politics, right? She's not yelling. She's kind of like more calm, more rational. She's not doing the yelling and things that the men around her do. So she does bring some kind of other style to politics. I don't know if it will help her, but
There's a second question there.
oh yeah, women seem to be. Yeah, sorry.
During the 1800s, women really worked hard politically, and Carrie Chapman Catt summed up all they had done. I mean, they went to legislators. They they conducted 56 campaigns of referenda to male voters, 480 campaigns to get legislators to submit suffrage amendments, 47 campaigns to get state constitutional conventions, and on and on. I mean, that's very political,
Right.
And not nice. I mean, you made a point that they were doing things that women could do nicely and not offend men, like, working for prohibition and so forth. But they were agitating politically.
Right, that was the suffrage movement. They're agitating, because in order to get the suffrage, they need to convince men. It's the men who needs to vote on it, right? But they do it in a way that is not to get him angry, right? So they're playing this very a delicate game of where they're pushing boundaries. They're marching in streets, right? That's not nice. They're picketing the president in the White House. That's not nice. They're getting into jail. That's not nice. But they're doing it, and they're middle-class women with money. So they have the privilege, right? They're not black women who are really nobody give a damn about them. People will listen to Belle Sherwin. She has money. She has an influential father. So she can push the boundaries more easily. And they're also, they dress nicely. They're doing all those spectaculars that kind of like make it more palatable to men. It's like, oh, these are kind of like, in the end, they're nice ladies walking in the street, so maybe I will vote for them. So they're kind of like pushing the envelope as much as they can. But they're not saying, okay, revolution. They're never saying that.
No, they're poking in, though.
Right.
The men didn't like it.
Yeah, until they did.
And I give them credit in the 1800s, too.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Hi, I'm Earl Johnson, a member of the Ohio Board of Education, and I'm glad it's a great segue when you said they didn't like it because I didn't hear a lot about the involvement of African American women during that time, and they were not welcome in the movement. 1913 March, my sorority, 22 founders of my sorority from Howard University, Delta Sigma Theta.
Right.
They marched 1913. That was their first public action, my 22
Right.
founders, and they were made to
With
march at the back.
Right.
But Ida B. Wells, who I'm sure you've heard of, who was also my soror, was made to, she
integrated.
She actually went to the front to march with Illinois, even though they were supposed to be marching at the back.
Right.
So I just think it's very important that when you do these presentations to just include a little bit of that, because African American women were very much involved. In the whole movement, and there were different goals too. So white women wanted to vote to be equal to men and so forth, and black women really just wanted to be able to make changes in the way they were being treated, and so they wanted to. That was a part of their motivation. So I just think it's important to mention that.
No, certainly, and women
like Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, who was also my soror. I think it's important to mention them.
No, definitely, and also in Cleveland, African American women were also involved in the campaign, and yet, and again, they're part of this history, but they were really pushed out by the white middle class leaders of the movement, and that history was really. We know, for example, that African American suffragists picketed the White House as well. They were part of that effort. But when press came, Ellis Paul made sure that the press did not come and take pictures on the days that the African American women picketed the White House. So we don't have any photographic evidence that they did it, but we know they did. And that's part of kind of like the problematic legacy. The suffragist movement was very much a white movement that fought for women's suffrage. African Americans worked for universal suffrage much more, because they thought that, for them it was not just about women. It was about the entire community. It was uplifting the entire community. Also. Right, and but also African American men were much more in favor of suffrage and of women's suffrage than white men. In the signers of the Declaration of Sentiment, we have Frederick Douglass, who was a supporter of women's rights. He ran with Victoria Woodhull for presidency, as her VP. They didn't get anywhere, but again, it's a very complicated history.
I think it's important to mention that white women were influenced by Native American women before then, when they saw how Native American women were not afraid to speak up and they were equal and so forth. And that was where that influence came from, of how they were saying, you know what, we need to do that too. So, those are kinds of things that I think should be mentioned. But
thank you.
Enjoyed what you said.
Thank you. Yeah.
A lot of the anti-suffrage people, one of their arguments was that if women get the right to vote, the black women would get the right to vote, and they didn't want that to happen. And so the white women, exactly.
And the suffrage movement in the South used that argument to vote. Like I showed you in the cartoon, many of the suffragists, when they campaigned in the South, it didn't help them because the southern states did not vote for suffrage. But when they campaigned for the South, that was part of their propaganda. Like, you need to give us the right to vote because that's how we can block the black vote. If you give white women the right to vote in the South. So yes. For many suffragists, again, suffrage was not like the end goal, but they were like, a lot of them kind of like make the compromise of like the end justifies the means. And they were like, whatever we can do and whatever we can say that would get us into suffrage. And they knew they had to have at least one southern state in order to ratify the amendment, which was Tennessee. Because, just number-wise, right? They needed the South support in order to pass an amendment. So again, they're doing those compromises, which are horrible. But they're also talking against immigrants, which cost them some votes in industrial centers like Cleveland, like New York, like Chicago. There's a lot of immigrant men there, but they're using that rhetoric again in order to convince men to give them the vote.
I think it's interesting that when it comes to the black vote, in 1920, when women got the vote, only 5% of the black men in the South were able to vote.
Right.
Because of black codes
Right.
and the Jim Crow laws.
And the Jim Crows.
And that pertained to black women. So, they were not feeling like they got the vote in 1920.
Oh, no,
And it really
that's what I
wasn't
said.
until 1965 with the
Yeah.
Voting Rights Act. So, there's a very suppressed history of voting in the South that is really gosh awful, actually.
Yeah.
And, I think we have to talk about that too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not only in the South. It's also in the North. But as I said at the, my first slide, right? Like when we think about the 19th Amendment that gave the right women to vote, A, it didn't give them anything, and B, it didn't give all women the right to vote, right? It gave a very small faction, even though it was the one time in history when the voting population grew immensely. Almost overnight. But no, it didn't give women the right to vote. It didn't give all women the right to vote. That was a far longer process. And kind of like in thinking about black vote and black women vote, one of the fears, right, was that women would form a voting bloc and they will vote as a bloc together. And if you look at it, and 100 years after, maybe the only bloc that you can talk about today is the African American women's vote, who vote 95% Democratic. These are women's bloc. And today, so kind of like the worst fears maybe got true, because black women do vote as a bloc, and they have a lot of power because of that. So that's something to consider as well. And they're willing to use it. Exactly. And they are the one who really vote consistently Democratic. And they're the most reliable vote. They're going to the polls, unlike other populations. Yes, that's true. So that's another thing to consider when we think about the fears that what happened when women got the vote. That's another thing that happened. Yeah, sure. Thank you.